The spring of 1836 arrived late in central Virginia's Appomattox region, winter clinging stubbornly to the rolling hills and tobacco fields that had sustained the area's economy for generations. The morning frost covering the ground like a reminder that even nature could be unpredictable and resistant to human expectations. In the slave quarters of Riverside Plantation, situated along one of the many creeks that fed into the Appomattox River, household servants gathered during the brief respite between dawn and the beginning of the day's labor, speaking in voices that carried both curiosity and something that might have been cautious optimism about an extraordinary purchase that had been completed 2 weeks earlier at the Farmville slave market. According to local legend, what had transpired that March morning defied every pattern they had learned to recognize in white families' behavior, challenging assumptions about why slaveholders made the acquisitions they did and what purposes those purchases were meant to serve. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 16 months would become a story whispered not just as a tale of suffering overcome, but as evidence that even within slavery's comprehensive brutality, unexpected alliances could form between people whom the system insisted must remain forever separated by unbridgeable divisions of race and status, creating possibilities for resistance and liberation that challenged everything the institution claimed about the fixed nature of power and the impossibility of crossing boundaries that law and custom had spent generations constructing and defending. Central Virginia's Appomattox region in the mid-1830s occupied a distinctive position in the Commonwealth's agricultural landscape, an area where tobacco cultivation had been the economic foundation for more than a century, but where soil exhaustion and declining prices had created pressures that forced even established planter families to reconsider their operations and their futures. The region lay inland from the tidewater aristocracy's coastal estates and lacked the dramatic mountain scenery of the Blue Ridge, existing in an agricultural middle ground where plantations were substantial but not enormous, where enslaved populations typically numbered in the dozens rather than the hundreds that worked the largest coastal operations. This scale created different social dynamics than those governing either the Tidewater's elaborate aristocratic pretensions or the Deep South's brutal cotton operations. A kind of middle ground slavery where proximity between slaveholding families and enslaved workers was closer than in larger operations, but where that proximity brought no meaningful mitigation of the system's fundamental violence and exploitation. Farmville had emerged as the region's commercial center, with markets operating regularly for both agricultural products and the enslaved people whose labor sustained the tobacco economy, even as that economy struggled against soil depletion and market fluctuations that made profitable operations increasingly difficult to maintain. The town served planters from Appomattox and surrounding counties who came to sell crops, purchase supplies, and occasionally to buy or sell human beings when financial pressures or estate settlements required adjustments to plantation labor forces. The slave market in Farmville operated with the same matter-of-fact brutality that characterized such institutions throughout Virginia and the South, auctioneers cataloging human capabilities with language that attempted to reduce complex lives to simple economic calculations. Families separated according to commercial logic that treated emotional bonds as irrelevant to transactions governed solely by considerations of productive value and profit maximization. The legal structures governing Virginia slavery in 1836 remained as comprehensive as they had been for generations, with slave codes that forbade enslaved people from learning to read, from gathering without white supervision, from traveling without written documentation, creating frameworks of control that attempted to eliminate every possible avenue for autonomous action or resistance. Yet enforcement of these codes varied significantly across different regions and among different slaveholding families, with some maintaining rigid discipline, while others permitted degrees of autonomy that would have scandalized more rigorous enforcers of slavery's protocols. Into this world of declining agricultural fortunes and varied enforcement of comprehensive legal restrictions came two people whose encounter would reveal that even long-married couples could harbor secrets from each other, that years of coexistence under slavery's roof could mask fundamental disagreements about the system's morality, and that the appearance of unified support for the institution could conceal quiet acts of subversion that would only become visible when circumstances forced hidden convictions into the open. Stories passed down through generations claim that the March morning in 1836, when Thomas and Rebecca Waverly attended the Farmville slave market, began with an argument that had been building for weeks. A conflict about the family's financial situation and the decisions that their declining circumstances seemed to require. Riverside Plantation had been in Thomas's family for 3 generations. But tobacco yields had been disappointing for years, and debts had accumulated to levels that threatened the estate's viability unless dramatic changes were made. Thomas had decided that the solution required selling several enslaved workers to raise capital that could be invested in diversifying crops or improving equipment. And he had identified specific individuals whose sale would generate sufficient revenue, while theoretically maintaining adequate labor for the estate's reduced operations. But Rebecca had opposed this plan with an intensity that surprised and frustrated her husband, arguing that the sales he proposed would separate families that had lived at Riverside for generations, and that there must be alternative approaches to addressing their financial difficulties that didn't require destroying the community bonds that she believed gave enslaved people their only protection against slavery's worst brutalities. The argument had remained unresolved when they traveled to Farmville that morning, Thomas intending to complete the sales he had planned while Rebecca hoping to find some way to prevent what she viewed as an unconscionable violation of obligations that she believed slaveholders owed to people whose labor had sustained their families across generations. According to oral histories, the morning's auction proceeded according to Thomas's intentions through its early stages, with him successfully selling 2 field workers for prices that would provide some relief from immediate financial pressures. But when the auctioneer brought a man named Encruma to the block, 7 feet and 8 inches tall, with a physique suggesting tremendous strength but also carrying visible evidence of brutal treatment by previous owners, something shifted in the dynamics between Thomas and Rebecca that would alter the day's trajectory in ways neither had anticipated. Rebecca had watched the morning's earlier sales with barely concealed distress, her face revealing the conflict between her obligation to support her husband's decisions and her personal conviction that what was happening violated moral principles she had been taught since childhood, by a mother whose Quaker background had created religious commitments to human equality that sat uncomfortably alongside the family's economic dependence on enslaved labor. But when she saw Encruma on that auction platform, when she observed the scars covering his back, and the way the auctioneer described him as difficult and prone to resistance that had made previous owners willing to sell him despite his obvious capacity for heavy labor, she made a decision that years of marriage had given her no precedent for making. She turned to Thomas and told him that they would purchase this man, that the money he had just raised through the sales she had opposed would be used to acquire someone whose size and history of resistance made him exactly the kind of acquisition that prudent plantation management would normally avoid. Thomas's response combined shock at his wife's presumption to dictate plantation business decisions, anger at what he perceived as her attempt to undermine choices he had carefully calculated, and something approaching fear about what purchasing someone described as resistant might mean for Riverside's security and his own authority. He told Rebecca that her suggestion was absurd, that they had come to raise money not to spend it on expensive acquisitions they didn't need, that purchasing someone with Encruma's reputation would create management problems that their already stressed operations couldn't absorb. But Rebecca's insistence was unyielding in ways that Thomas had never encountered in their marriage, her voice carrying a conviction that transcended mere disagreement to suggest she was acting on principles she considered non-negotiable, regardless of his objections or their economic circumstances. She told him that if he would not bid, she would use her own family inheritance to make the purchase independent of his consent, a threat that Thomas understood carried real weight since Virginia law gave married women limited property rights, but did permit them to control inheritances from their birth families under certain conditions. More significantly, she made clear that this was not a request or a suggestion, but a line she was drawing about what she would tolerate in her own name and with her own complicity, that she had acquiesced to the sales he demanded, but would not allow the morning to pass without some action that honored her own moral convictions, even if that action made no economic sense and created complications for plantation operations. Faced with a public confrontation that would humiliate him before other planters, and with his wife's determination that seemed to transcend rational calculation, Thomas bid on Encruma with barely concealed resentment, competing against 2 other planters and finally securing him for $1,900, a price that consumed most of what he had raised through the earlier sales and that left him with minimal financial improvement despite the morning's transactions. As they completed the purchase and arranged for Encruma to be transported to Riverside, Thomas demanded to know what Rebecca thought she was accomplishing, what possible purpose could justify such an expensive and potentially dangerous acquisition. But her response offered no explanation that satisfied his questions, speaking instead about moral obligations and Christian duties in terms so general that they seemed to deliberately avoid addressing his specific concerns. What Thomas did not know, what Rebecca's careful discretion over years had prevented him from discovering, was that she had been conducting a quiet campaign of resistance against slavery's brutalities that manifested in ways her husband never noticed because he assumed her household management decisions were motivated by the same economic calculations that governed his own thinking, rather than by moral convictions that he would have found deeply threatening had he understood their implications. Rebecca had grown up in a household where her mother's Quaker heritage created religious teachings about human equality that coexisted uneasily with the family's economic dependence on enslaved labor. And she had internalized from childhood a conviction that slavery was morally wrong, even as she lacked the courage or perhaps the imagination to openly oppose an institution so fundamental to Virginia society that challenging it seemed both futile and socially suicidal. When she married Thomas and became mistress of Riverside, she had initially hoped that she could influence him toward more humane treatment of enslaved workers. That proximity and daily interaction might soften whatever abstract justifications allowed him to maintain the system with apparent moral ease. But she had gradually recognized that Thomas's commitment to slavery was more fundamental than mere economic interest, that he had internalized beliefs about racial hierarchy and the naturalness of black servitude that no amount of persuasion from her would dislodge. So Rebecca had begun taking actions that she could never acknowledge openly, using her authority over household operations to create small spaces of relative safety and autonomy that mitigated slavery's worst effects without directly challenging Thomas's ultimate control. She taught household servants to read despite laws forbidding literacy, recognizing that education represented power that might someday prove valuable. She maintained contacts with free black families in Farmville and surrounding areas, relationships that Thomas assumed were simply appropriate social connections, but that actually created networks through which information and occasionally assistance could flow. Most significantly, she had begun using her own inherited money to occasionally purchase enslaved people, whom she then quietly manumitted after establishing legal grounds that made the freedom technically compliant with Virginia's restrictive laws governing private emancipation, though she had to execute these liberations with such caution that Thomas never learned about them or understood that his wife was actively working to undermine the institution their household depended upon. When Rebecca saw Encruma on that auction block, she had recognized in his bearing and in the auctioneer's descriptions of his difficult nature someone who possessed not just physical strength but a spirit that previous owners had failed to break despite brutal attempts. Someone who would likely be worked to death by any planter who purchased him for the heavy labor his size suggested he was suited for. In that moment of recognition, she had made a decision that she understood carried enormous risks, that she would purchase him not to exploit his labor, but to help him survive and ultimately to facilitate his escape to freedom through the same networks she had been carefully developing for years. The decision violated everything Thomas believed about plantation management and defied the basic economic logic of slavery, but it honored commitments that Rebecca had maintained privately even while outwardly conforming to the role of dutiful plantation mistress that her marriage and social position required. Encruma arrived at Riverside on a March evening when the late winter chills still made the air uncomfortable, and when the plantation's routines were settling into the patterns that would govern operations through the coming growing season. Thomas assigned him immediately to the most demanding field labor, intending to establish from the beginning that his size offered no protection from total subjection to plantation discipline, and that any resistance would be met with the kind of brutal response that had supposedly made him difficult for previous owners. But what Thomas did not observe, what the plantation's operations made invisible to him as he focused on managing declining agricultural revenues and mounting debts, was that Rebecca began finding ways to communicate with Encruma that seemed routine from external observation, but that actually served purposes her husband would have found intolerable had he understood what was occurring. She would bring food to field workers during the day, a practice that Thomas viewed as appropriate concern for maintaining valuable property, but that gave Rebecca opportunities to speak briefly with Encruma in ways that other workers could not easily overhear. She assigned him to maintenance work on outbuildings and equipment, tasks that his strength made him well suited for, but that also placed him in areas where brief exchanges could occur. Most crucially, she ensured he was given responsibilities that required him to travel occasionally to Farmville for supplies or equipment repairs, journeys that Thomas viewed as efficient use of someone whose size made him capable of transporting heavy loads, but that actually served Rebecca's purposes by giving Encruma knowledge of roads and contacts in town that could prove essential if escape ever became possible. Through these carefully orchestrated interactions, Rebecca communicated information that Encruma understood represented either genuine assistance or an elaborate trap, though he had no way initially to determine which possibility was correct. She told him that she opposed slavery on moral grounds despite her position as plantation mistress, that she maintained contacts who could provide assistance to those seeking freedom, that she would help him escape when timing and circumstances made such assistance viable without creating suspicions that would endanger everyone involved. Encruma listened to these communications with profound skepticism, born from years of experiencing white people's capacity for betrayal and manipulation. Understanding that even apparently sympathetic whites often used offers of assistance to identify those planning resistance so that brutal examples could be made of them. But he also recognized that his circumstances at Riverside might never again provide opportunities like those Rebecca seemed to be offering, and that refusing potential assistance because it seemed implausible might itself be a form of self-defeating caution that kept people enslaved when freedom could be achieved through calculated risk-taking. The spring and summer of 1836 brought a period of careful mutual assessment, during which Rebecca worked to demonstrate to Encruma that her assistance was genuine, while he simultaneously tested the boundaries of what she claimed to be offering. Both of them understanding that trust between people positioned as they were required evidence more substantial than mere verbal assurances. Rebecca began providing Encruma with information about escape routes toward the north, explaining the geography and the locations of free Black communities that might offer assistance, sharing knowledge about patrol schedules and surveillance patterns that could help someone attempting flight avoid the most dangerous detection points. She gave him access to maps and written materials that helped him understand the landscape between Virginia and Free Territory, resources that her position allowed her to possess, but that could result in severe punishment for any enslaved person found with such materials. Most significantly, she began accumulating resources that would be necessary for actual escape: food that could sustain someone for extended travel, clothing suitable for moving through varied terrain and weather, and most crucially, forged papers that identified Encruma as a free Black man traveling on legitimate business, documents that Rebecca obtained through her contacts in Farmville at considerable personal risk and financial expense. Encruma, observing these preparations and testing Rebecca's claims through small acts that could reveal whether her assistance was genuine or whether she would report resistance to Thomas, gradually came to believe that her opposition to slavery was authentic and that her assistance represented real possibilities for achieving freedom despite the enormous risks that escape always entailed. By fall of 1836, the careful preparations that Rebecca and Encruma had maintained for months began moving toward actual implementation, as circumstances created an opportunity that might not reoccur. Thomas Waverly needed to travel to Richmond for extended negotiations with creditors about Riverside's debt situation, meetings that would keep him away from the plantation for at least 2 weeks, and that would leave Rebecca in practical control of daily operations. She communicated to Encruma through their established methods that he should prepare to attempt escape during this window, that she would create conditions necessary for flight, but that timing would depend on variables she could not completely control. The plan they developed involved Encruma departing on what would appear to be a routine trip to Farmville for plantation supplies, a task he had performed multiple times and that would not immediately raise suspicions. But instead of returning to Riverside, he would continue north, using routes Rebecca had mapped and relying on contacts she had arranged. The opportunity came in October 1836, during the week when Thomas departed for Richmond and when weather conditions seemed favorable for extended travel. Rebecca sent Encruma to Farmville with a list of supplies to purchase, and with a wagon that ostensibly would be needed to transport those materials back to Riverside. But she also provided him with the forged papers identifying him as a free Black man, with money that would help him purchase passage on boats or stages that could speed his journey north, and with detailed instructions about contacts he should seek who could provide further assistance toward Pennsylvania. Their final conversation before his departure, as preserved in oral traditions maintained by those who later assisted his flight, acknowledged both the gratitude he felt for assistance he had never expected to receive from someone of her position, and the recognition that she was taking enormous risks that could destroy her own life if her role in his escape were discovered. Encruma left Riverside on an October morning when the autumn air carried hints of the coming winter, and when the plantation's routines seemed to proceed normally despite the extraordinary nature of what was actually occurring. He traveled to Farmville as instructed, purchasing some of the supplies Rebecca had specified to create the appearance of legitimate business, then quietly abandoned the wagon at a location she had arranged, and continued north on foot, and occasionally by hired transport. using the forged papers to deflect questions about his right to travel, and relying on the contacts Rebecca had provided to find assistance at critical points along the route. The journey from Appomattox to Free Territory required weeks of careful travel, moving through a landscape where slave patrols operated with legal authority and financial incentives to capture fugitives, where any black person's presence without proper documentation could result in arrest and sale, regardless of their actual legal status. According to fragmentary accounts preserved in oral histories, Encruma successfully navigated these dangers through a combination of the preparation Rebecca had provided, his own intelligence and resourcefulness, and assistance from free black communities and anti-slavery networks that took enormous risks to help those seeking freedom. By November 1836, he had reached Pennsylvania and was making his way toward Philadelphia, where established free black communities could provide support for establishing new identity and finding employment. What happened to him after reaching Free Territory remains largely undocumented, as fugitives maintained careful discretion about their origins and the circumstances of their escape, to avoid providing information that could be used for recapture or that might endanger those who had assisted their flight. Some accounts suggest he eventually made his way to Canada, recognizing that even in free states, the Fugitive Slave Act created risks that only British territory could fully eliminate, while others claim he remained in Pennsylvania, building a life in freedom while maintaining the careful silence that survival demanded. Back at Riverside, Rebecca managed the aftermath of Encruma's disappearance with a performance of confused concern that she had carefully prepared, claiming initially that he had failed to return from Farmville and suggesting various explanations ranging from accident to kidnapping to simple flight. When Thomas returned from Richmond to discover that his most expensive and physically distinctive acquisition had vanished, his fury was complicated by the reality that his absence had created the conditions that made escape possible, and that blaming Rebecca too directly would require acknowledging his own role in leaving the plantation inadequately supervised. He organized searches and offered rewards, contacted slave catchers, and placed advertisements describing Encruma's extraordinary height, but the trail had gone cold with a completeness that frustrated even experienced pursuers who understood how to track fugitives through landscapes they knew intimately. Whether Thomas ever suspected his wife's role in Encruma's escape remains uncertain from the fragmentary evidence available. If suspicions developed, he never acted on them openly, perhaps because accusing Rebecca would require confronting the possibility that his own household harbored opposition to slavery fundamental enough to actively subvert his authority, or perhaps because admitting his wife's betrayal would humiliate him before other planters in ways that silence about his suspicions could avoid. Rebecca maintained careful discretion about her involvement, understanding that even years later, revelation could endanger both herself and others who had participated in facilitating the escape. The financial loss from Encruma's disappearance, combined with other pressures, eventually forced Thomas to make more dramatic adjustments to Riverside's operations, selling off portions of the estate and reducing the enslaved workforce to levels that could be sustained by declining agricultural revenues. The impact of Encruma's escape rippled through enslaved communities and anti-slavery networks in ways that official records never captured, but that oral traditions preserved across generations. For enslaved people in the Appomattox region, the story of someone so physically distinctive successfully escaping despite every apparent disadvantage his size created became evidence that freedom was achievable even when circumstances seemed hopeless. That careful planning, combined with unexpected assistance, could overcome surveillance mechanisms that appeared comprehensive. The tale spread through networks connecting enslaved communities across plantations, and through contacts between field workers and household servants who carried information along with their regular duties, becoming part of a larger tradition of escape narratives that sustained hope and provided practical knowledge about how resistance could succeed. For the networks that assisted fugitives toward freedom, Encruma's escape demonstrated the crucial importance of allies within slaveholding households, people whose positions gave them access to resources and information that could mean the difference between successful flight and recapture. Rebecca's role, though it could never be publicly acknowledged during her lifetime in Virginia, became known among those who coordinated assistance, encouraging others who felt moral opposition to slavery to move from passive disapproval toward active subversion, despite the personal risks such involvement entailed. The story suggested that even long marriages and apparently unified households could conceal fundamental disagreements about slavery's morality, that years of outward conformity to expected roles could mask quiet campaigns of resistance that only became visible when actions forced hidden convictions into the open. The deeper truth that emerges from Encruma and Rebecca's story transcends the specific details of one escape from one Virginia plantation in 1836, revealing essential insights about moral courage, the possibilities for resistance within oppressive systems, and the complex ways that individuals navigated between their social positions and their personal convictions. Their experience demonstrates that slavery, despite its comprehensive legal structures and systematic violence, could never achieve the total control its ideology claimed, that the system depended on cooperation from people whose conscience or calculation might lead them toward subversion rather than enforcement. Every successful escape involved not just the fugitive's courage and intelligence, but assistance from others who took risks that their positions made particularly costly, creating chains of support that connected people across boundaries that slavery worked desperately to maintain as unbridgeable. The story also illuminates the particular forms that resistance took for white women whose positions within slaveholding society gave them both power over enslaved people and subordination to male authority that limited their ability to openly oppose institutions their husbands supported. Rebecca's actions represented a kind of resistance that required years of patient preparation, careful maintenance of deceptions, and willingness to violate both her economic interests and her marital obligations in service of moral convictions she could never publicly acknowledge. Her choices demonstrated that even people whose positions benefited from oppressive systems could choose to use their power subversively, that moral courage sometimes manifested not in dramatic public gestures, but in quiet, persistent refusals to fully cooperate with evil, even when open opposition seemed impossible. Perhaps most significantly, the story reveals that assumptions about fixed boundaries between enslaved and free, between oppressor and liberator, between self-interest and moral action were always more permeable than slavery's defenders claimed, or than even many opponents recognized. The possibility of alliance between a plantation mistress and an enslaved man represented a profound challenge to the racial and social hierarchies that slavery depended upon, suggesting that shared commitment to human dignity and freedom could create bonds that transcended the divisions that law and custom had spent generations constructing. These alliances were necessarily fragile and dangerous, operating in spaces of extraordinary vulnerability where discovery meant catastrophic consequences for all involved, but their existence demonstrated that slavery's comprehensive apparatus of control could never fully eliminate the human capacity for moral choice and mutual assistance. The legacy preserved in oral traditions about Encruma and others like him speaks to truth that official history systematically excluded, that slavery was always contested, always resisted, always undermined by both those it sought to reduce to property, and by some whose positions gave them power within the system, but whose consciences led them towards subversion. Every successful escape represented not just individual achievement, but collective action involving networks of people who risked their own security to assist others toward freedom, creating traditions of resistance that would eventually contribute to slavery's destruction, even when individual participants never lived to see that ultimate victory. These stories preserved knowledge about courage and moral complexity that documentation controlled by slaveholders worked actively to suppress, maintaining across generations the understanding that freedom was achievable through strategic action, that unexpected alliances could form even within slavery's most intimate power relationships, and that human dignity and moral conviction could never be fully extinguished regardless of how comprehensive the apparatus of oppression. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities preserved when official history tried to erase them, that resistance stood 7 feet 8 inches tall, purchased at a wife's insistence not to be exploited, but to be helped toward freedom, assisted by a plantation mistress whose moral convictions led her to violate every expectation of her position, and whose careful subversion of her husband's authority created possibilities that the system insisted could never exist. Encruma's journey from the auction block in Farmville to freedom in the North lasted barely 8 months from purchase to escape. But his story became part of traditions through which enslaved communities preserved both hope and practical knowledge about resistance. Proof that freedom was possible even when circumstances seemed hopeless, that moral courage could emerge from unexpected sources, and that the boundaries slavery worked so desperately to maintain as fixed and unbridgeable could be crossed by those willing to risk everything for the conviction that human beings possessed inherent dignity and worth that no system of oppression could legitimately deny or permanently suppress.